Welcome to another episode of Telegeography Explains the Internet. This is the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I am your host, Greg Bryan, and my guest today is Michael Martin, formerly the Global Network and Security Architect at McKinsey & Company. Michael has a wide breadth of experience and knowledge in the enterprise networking space, and I wanted to get his take on the state of the industry in terms of implementing network automation in the enterprise WAN. We get into the topic fairly deeply, looking at what can be automated and what enterprises should consider when moving towards automating various processes. We talk about human infrastructure and that element that rears its head when moving towards automation, and what issues or oversights you should look out for. Of course, security has to be a part of the automation conversation, so we get into that as well. And we also touch on the human capital issue in terms of skills gaps and the impact of automation on the network team itself. As I said, this episode is pretty dense, so I want to let us get right to it. But really quickly before I do, I just wanted to first say thank you to all of you who have reached out on LinkedIn or elsewhere about the show. I really appreciate hearing from you, and especially feedback about the show or ideas that you might have. So please feel free to do that. Also, please like and subscribe and leave a review on whatever platform you are hearing us on. And just a quick heads up, we are soon heading out on a bit of a hiatus for the show while we work on another Telegeography Literally Explains series. So look out for that in a couple of months. Okay, enjoy the interview. Okay, welcome back to the show, Michael.
Thank you very much for having me, Greg.
Yeah, absolutely. So it has been a little while since I had you on. So and it's always just good to remind folks who may be catching this episode of just some background on yourself and what you've been up to in the telecom industry.
Okay, so actually, the last time we talked, it was just after when people were coming out of the pandemic. And we were talking about SD-WANs.
Yeah.
And this is we're going to talk about a topic that's sort of along the same lines. So
yeah.
I used to be the global network and network security architect for McKinsey & Company. Recently, I left to start doing sort of my own thing. And so I've been doing some consulting with product people and different things. But I'm still very, very interested in network automation, and I sort of take my sort of perspective is that there's all these amazing tools that didn't exist decades ago when I started. Right. So, but unfortunately, what's really now what I see happening is just now you have these folks who don't have the systems and the process and all of the sort of structural skills to build these things. Like, you can get people to write scripts to do anything. That seems to be the easy thing. And apparently, according to everybody who does AI, we'll just have the computers write the scripts for us.
Right.
So we wouldn't have to
just have to write prompts now, right?
Yeah. So, but the reality is that a script is not an automated function. Automated functions have very specific, attributes. They have to be reversible, and they have to be validated, and they have to, it has to be authentication, and these sort of pesky things that are sort of hard to write and code. So, but I do believe, and I'm very committed to this idea that I think that all enterprises, right, not necessarily within a large investment, right, in proprietary software, right, just using standard Unix open systems tools and with proper, process engineering and systems engineering can easily build a platform to support, self-serve automation or network automation or whatever your requirements are. It's funny. I remember about a year ago, I was sitting in a meeting and a vendor is presenting a cloud security process, and this person says, so does that process then go talk to the automation? And the vendor just stopped cold, and they were like, uh yeah, maybe.
Let's go figure that out, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
we have to talk to somebody and we'll get back to you.
Mhm.
And that was when I realized, right, wow, despite everything, we haven't really gotten as far along as
Mhm.
we expected to be in terms of automation.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly why this is a good time for that conversation, and also, because as you mentioned, coming from McKinsey as a network manager, but also, just a little sort of background on you that I know, right? Is you were also working with McKinsey's clients, right? So getting a view on what the broader enterprise world, not just as one network manager at one company, would see,
Right.
right? So.
Yeah. And again, the thing is that there's a lot of general themes that you see with all enterprises, right? You know, enterprises they have people who are inevitably sort of always drinking from a fire hose, right?
Hmm.
And in this post-pandemic world, what we also have seen is that many companies, no matter what size they are, were so impacted with sort of the logistics and the global shutdown. I mean,
Hmm.
some vendors, right, you know, back in the heyday, right, during the dot-com era, you'd be sitting there talking to a vendor and they'd say, well, we can get you product in 6 months, right? And then it was make or break, right? Oh my God, if I don't have the product, I can't deploy, and my
Right.
VC funding will be gone. Now, you know, you shut down the entire world for, a few months, and you can't even imagine the logistical problems that come from that.
Yeah.
So now you have vendors who are like, oh, yeah, we'll have that product 18 months. And you're like, 18 months? Now, in cloud years, right?
Right.
Like dog years, that's half of a product life cycle,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So to say I have to wait 18 months for a product that has like a 36-month like peak life cycle, that's a big deal.
Right.
So, you know, so so when I was having a conversation the other day, I said the ideal solution for any enterprise is I want a system that will self update, right? Doesn't go end of life, and that I can configure from a central single point or single pane of glass.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
if you could sell me that, I'll buy that tomorrow. And I say, well, that'd be great, but that doesn't exist.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
you'll have to make that yourself if that's what you
Yeah.
want. So
Now you raise an
that
interesting point there that in thinking about automation, it's about code, it's about software, but networks are fundamentally still infrastructure, right? And infrastructure has a life cycle that is very different than the software cloud kind of life cycle. And I think rectifying those two things is a nut that no one seems to have cracked yet, right?
So yeah, so with the thing is, when most people think about automation, they think about uh, sec and DevOps, right?
Hmm.
Um, because for some people who remember AWS when it only had like one product, right? If you were trying to build out your environment, it could take you a month, right?
Right. Right.
you know, so that environment lended itself immediately for automation, right? Which
Hmm.
is sort of what has exploded in these tools, right? A lot of the more sort of common configuration management tools like CF Engine and Puppet and Chef and that, those products really got their legs just managing large scale Unix environments. This is
Hmm.
for pre-cloud, right? So, but networking isn't like that, right?
Right. Right.
They're While there are a lot of products that have API interfaces, inevitably they're still built around using a command line interface, or they have a GUI, and inevitably, no matter what product you have, even if it has a web interface or whatever, there's always going to be this process where you have to go and manually configure something,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, and just that little piece, that how do I get it under management, is a humongous challenge, right? That you can spend months trying to solve, because Well, now I have to take a device that I don't know anything about, and then I have to get it onto my network. I have to get it somehow authenticated, and I have to be able to provide some sort of identity to it, and also it comes with usually a set of credentials that you can do 2-second Google search, and you're like, oh, the password for this is that,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know. So when you're trying to, and that's where process and and systems and logistics engineering starts to come into play, because
Hmm.
now you have to start to think about, well, if I was a human, I get the box and then I open the box, right? And then I complain about the fact that I can't get the box open because there's horribly super tape that apparently you can't buy anywhere except if you ship boxes.
Yeah.
And I get the thing out, and now I have to mess around with my USB serial terminal
Mm.
interface on my laptop, which my security team has disabled because they don't want me to do anything with USB anymore.
Right.
So it's like, so you go through all these challenges to get this device connected, and 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 then there's this whole process, right? So, but just that, it's the most significant thing. Now, if you have 1,000 locations, right, and
Right.
even if you're
Right.
even if you're buying a product that has a cloud management format, and there's a lot of companies out there that have built really wonderful sort of cloud management interfaces, you just connect the device. Well, yeah, but I have to have internet.
Hmm.
Well, if this is the device that you're configuring that basically
To get on the
provides the
internet.
internet,
Yeah. Right.
you know,
Yeah.
that's a problem.
Hmm.
So it's when you're starting to think about large scale, automation, you have to start to begin to think about these things. Well, what does it look like when you're starting from a green field, right?
Right.
And and then what are those 10 or 15, right, life cycle transactions that have to happen before I can say, yes, this is the device that I'm willing to be connected to my live network.
Hmm.
And then once you've gotten to there, right? Because remember, you could buy a device and it just so happens that that vendor happens to have a problem with the supply chain, you know, issue. Like the device is compromised, right?
Right.
And you've got, and then you find out one morning, and oh, there's a supply chain issue with such and such as operating system, and you're like, oh, I have 25 of those devices connected to my network right now that aren't
Hmm.
configured, right?
Right.
So you have to think about all these sorts of things, and when you're a network administrator or you're on a networking team, since most of that is all people driven, right? I don't have to think about those things because humans are amazing at inferring and navigating complex situations.
Hmm.
Computers, not so much, right?
Unless
Despite,
you have to give it a specific
yeah,
heuristic and decision tree, and without that, it does nothing. Right. So yeah. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's like, I can add and subtract numbers, well, really
Right.
just add
Right.
really fast. That's it. Everything
Hmm.
else after that is just an abstraction that just
Right.
uses that one function. So, that's what I find, or especially when you're having a conversation. Um, well, we want to and use, like, again, SD-WAN or SD-LAN, but the thing about the software piece of it is the software piece of it makes it very flexible, right?
Hmm.
I'm not tied to that infrastructure. I've abstracted myself away, right? So inevitably, right, when you're thinking about your automation journey, you have to start to think about that. Well, what are all the environments that need to operate this in? Like, is it
Hmm.
just my data center? Is it just offices? How do I support that little communication change between the office and the data center, or the internet, or the cloud, and again, companies are great at building, point products, right? Point solutions, because that's what they're in the business to do. But as an enterprise, you sort of still have to stitch all of that together,
Right.
right? And that's where a larger self-serve automation approach takes place, where you have to start to think about really your logistics processes. How do you procure those things? You know, Initially, a lot of companies, when they were starting their automation journey, were really heavily investing in the source of truth, right? Um, and which we other people would just call it inventory, right, of
Right.
assets, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
but the reason why. we've elevated it to this source of truth is because inevitably there has to be a basis of trust, right? And this was
Hmm.
like a concept that was brought into automation very early on. We have to basically have a certain degree of certainty, right? And we have to trust the fidelity of that certainty, right? Because what might be true 1 minute may not be true 10 minutes later.
Hmm.
And 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 your approach has to sort of accommodate for that. Like we've all had the thing, you click on the button and it's supposed to send you like some six digit code.
Right.
And then you get distracted. And then, oh, well, there's a 6 digit code. Oh, your session's timed out. Now you need
Right.
a new 6 digit code.
Hmm.
And in some systems, if you've done that 3 times, we're
It locks
locking you
you
out.
out. Right. Right.
You know,
Yeah, and there's going to be little roadblocks like that throughout the entire process, cascading across, like you said, maybe 1,000 sites, and then that metastasizes into something that's insurmountable, right? So,
yeah.
yeah,
So when you're starting that journey, you know, the first thing you have to make sure is that you have defined a set of processes that you want to automate,
right,
right?
right.
And that they have clear, understandable processes that have
I
been
was going
sort
to
of
say that
translated.
those processes can be automated in a way that you don't end up with, like I said, kind of decision trees that don't match, right? So yeah,
Yeah, a good friend of mine was said he's like, yeah, so we send automation teams, engineers into customers. We spend so much time trying to get the answer to the question. So what do you do when you do that,
right,
right?
right, exactly,
And you know, and then they answer the question. They're like, yeah, okay, no, that's what you typed. What do you do, right?
right.
Because it's all, well, where did you get that information from, and who did you have to communicate to do that, and right, because now that's where the process comes in,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
And it's that engineering, right, that you have to sort of rethink when you're making that decision that I would like a computer to do this for
Hmm.
me, and not think about it, right? I mean,
Hmm.
think about it at scale. Basic problem. I want to do software upgrades, right? Okay, well, so you're automating software upgrades. So all the upgrades for the first 30 devices goes great. Device 31,
Right.
okay.
Why?
Does your
That's
right?
yeah,
Does your
exactly.
process stop?
How do I
Right?
determine why? Right.
Right. Does your process stop automatically? Right. And then it basically notifies. Does the process stop automatically and then reverse the upgrade process on the other platforms that are actually running? Right.
Hmm.
And by the way, okay, when that failed, can I reverse that process? Right. It's that reversibility
Hmm.
thing is a big problem
Right. Right.
because and by the way, and I love this one, and I used to ask this question all the time when I would be troubleshooting, right? Uh, so what was the state before things broke? Well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, right. Well, was the do you have any data on was the router was the CPU inching up over like a 3 or 4 day period, right? Were you seeing a lot of traffic? Like, you know, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean? What do
Right.
you mean? Like, this is important information right now.
Right.
So when you're automating, though, those are the things that you have to start to sort of flush out and build processes and structures around because
Right.
it's so whether you want to call it a decision tree or a flow map or
Hmm.
there's all sorts of different terms for it, but you can spend more time working on that, right? Because the coding piece, right, again, thanks to AI and because
Pretty
there
easy.
are
Yeah.
there's uh, a lot of contributors out there. There's a lot of people who basically you know love doing this
Right.
and they love contributing to the community. So the
Hmm.
fact is, you can always find some code to start from. You don't necessarily have to start from scratch with everything,
Right.
right? And so but sometimes it actually is helpful, right? Um, for somebody who is, I just configured devices with my keyboard, right? To start to actually just go through that process without looking at other people's code. Like, so if I had to
Mm-hmm.
write a script on how to do that, what would that script look like, right?
Right. Right.
So it's and that's the other thing I found was because I'm doing this a long time. So when I was at McKinsey initially, the big push for me for almost all the engineering stuff was you need to write scripts. You have to write code. We should audit. We should all be automating this stuff, right? And then some engineers are like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And then some engineers do want to do that. So
Right.
you can't necessarily force people, right?
Right.
But of course, if you build a tool that people can use, they'll always use the tool because everybody's busy. They want to minimize their work, right?
Right.
So, but not everybody is a coder. Like
Right.
not everybody
Right.
likes code. Writing code is a very solitary activity for a lot of people. So, it doesn't necessarily their bailiwick. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't basically still do automation, because a lot of the tooling is there. And now, instead of you writing code, now this is much more of a transactional exchange, right? I'm using a set of tools, right? So a lot of times, a good way to start is identify the 10 or 15 things that you want to automate first, then do the due diligence and research, see what is available, right, in Terraform or in Ansible or in whatever platform you happen to be using, right? And then also being aware that you probably want to do a little research on what platforms you want to use, because the reality is that each of these platforms are all custom to do very specific things. So, if you're trying to do configuration management, you're going to lean one way. If you're trying to do infrastructure as code, or very, very complex, application, DevOps implementations, there are different tools for each one. But despite the fact that they now have great names like pipelines and a script, and then they have, repositories, a directory, and they have all these great terms, but these are all basically still the most fundamental functions, because, it's not a technology industry if you're not constantly renaming and rebranding and remarketing, because
That's right.
It has to be that way.
That is how it works. Yeah. All right. So we have, you've identified what you want to automate. You're finding the best tools to make that automation happen. But, Michael, a very common theme on the show, and one that we've talked about a fair bit in the past, is the idea that the old way of thinking of the network was kind of like, IT and whatever other sort of business your enterprise is in are saying, okay, well, we have these things that we're doing, and let's assume there's a network underneath that we can do those with. Whereas, that I think a lot of WAN managers are wrapping their minds around the sort of WAN, the network being a part of those kind of business goals now, right? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that aspect of integrating, like, not just how do we have a network that works underneath everything that the company is doing, but more thinking about how does the network work with whatever a kind of line of business you're in, whatever the enterprise's business goals are.
So if you're just looking at network connectivity, that's sort of ubiquitous now, right? It's very rare that you can't get online somehow, right?
Right.
Now, with that all said, that is not necessarily, just because you can get connectivity doesn't mean that it's connectivity that is quality. Like I probably wouldn't try to, do a video podcast, right? Stealing my neighbor's internet, right?
Right.
Be connected to their guest network, right?
Yeah.
And the fact is that you're probably, most people have now gotten used to, right, a little robotics, sound not being perfect, that those things, just with cell phones and everything. But really, the thing about the network now is, and I think that this is what people are sort of still struggling and coming to terms with, is that the network represents this one place of visibility, right, and vulnerability, all wrapped into one, right? So on one hand, you have bad actors all the time trying to basically, right, collect data, capture data, compromise, and whatever. And then at the same time, you have people who are constantly, right, trying to, figure out there is no network boundary, right? There is no such thing as a private data network. And inevitably, right, that concept of the private network, right, isn't wasn't necessarily a security tenant, but it was just, well, you listen, who am I connecting my Banyan Vines network to? Like the
Right.
business next door, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most enterprise networks were closed systems anyway.
Right.
When they became potentially public networks or quasi-public networks is when business started connecting to the internet, right?
Right.
And then businesses had to go through the discussion of, yeah, there's a public side, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's this private side, and then we had these firewalls that said, yeah, if you're behind the firewall, you can do whatever you want, and if you're outside the firewall, you're not allowed in, right?
Right.
Well, that's all gone, right?
Yep.
But even software doesn't work that way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Really, the way I sort of try to frame networks, and why they're so important is it because that's how you see what's going on, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
what you see in terms of the traffic, transactions, the behaviors. That's the visibility you have. So what I've been seeing is more and more, and I was a very big proponent of this for the last 2 decades, is networking and network security really are sort of the same thing.
Right.
You can't have security if you don't have visibility, and the only way you really have visibility is with the network. And you can make this argument, well, I can abstract away from that, right? But inevitably, right, as soon as you connect a device to a network, right, depending upon the configuration of the device, that device is now a target,
Mm-hmm.
and it's
Mm-hmm.
now compromisable. So, you know, and that's one of the reasons why automating your network is so critical, because if you are having to respond right to an event, right, if you have a supply chain event with one of your networking vendors, you have to push out code upgrades to 1,000 devices, automation is a real big friend of yours at that
Right. So
moment,
you're not
right?
just whack-a-moling every
Yeah.
possibility that comes along, but prepared for them instead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a reasons why you're sort of, making those changes, but that's what, I think most people struggle with now is people just see connectivity as that's what the network is, right?
Mm-hmm.
But secure connectivity, and having the proper visibility, right, to be able to control, right, what people are doing with your applications is really critical. So
Mm-hmm.
and this gets particularly difficult in public cloud, right? And the great thing is that in the public cloud space, security is paramount, because again, if no one trusts your product, they're not going to use it.
Right.
So
Right.
you don't have to worry about the nuts and bolts of the security pieces of that, because there's somebody who's worrying about that all the time, right? But you just having to worry about your security, right, and then where your users are coming from and how they're connecting is sort of important. And this will become more and more important, right, in the next 5 or 6 or 10 years, as we begin to lose the ability to secure data, at least with our current security protocols, because we're
In a
now
quantum
beginning to
environment.
edge into that post-quantum cipher universe,
Mm-hmm.
where, oh, yeah, that big gigantic data dump you did. Yeah, well, some bad actor copied all that, and now they could decrypt it because,
Right.
they have your initial session keys because they captured the
Right.
whole thing. So it's what you're doing with your network today is probably more important. Um, so I like to say, you have a building that you operate your business in. That network is sort of like the virtual building, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily um, you know do anything, but you need to
Right.
have it, and
Mm-hmm.
it provides you the protection that you need in order for you to be able to transact.
Right. Right. But to your point, that viewing it purely as infrastructure in the sense of, okay, there's just like you wouldn't view the building purely as infrastructure, and that you wouldn't have people coming to work on concrete floors with no plumbing and stuff, right?
Right,
But
exactly.
that also that there's that connectivity piece there. But what's really important is the visibility, the data, and the policies that come along with that. That it's not just about availability. In other words, right? It's about how you can keep the business flowing. Sure, sometimes a backhoe is going to cut a wire and things like that, but there's a lot more that can happen over the top of that physical infrastructure layer.
Well, I think back in the day, back in the old days, that was the big joke. Oh yeah, there's an OC3 circuit that runs through a nunnery, and
Right.
we could, so we were doing a backhoe where they were digging up or somebody was digging the garden, and they
Yeah. Yeah.
and now you're not going to have connectivity for a week.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Though, that world
Yeah.
is gone, thank God.
Mm.
Right. But back then, that was the availability, right, and sustainability, right, was everything, right.
Mm-hmm.
But now, now that since everybody has a network, right, now that problem of how do I maintain that space, right, and deal with, right, it's like a homeowner, or a car owner. I have to do things. I have to get new
Right.
tires. I have to get my
Mhm.
oil changed. I have to do this. I have to refresh routers, right? I have to review my security policies. I have to, reevaluate transactions, right?
Mhm.
It's, there's this kind of thing where, you that piece of equipment's retired. Okay, well, did we power it off? Well, no, not yet. Well, when are we going to power it off? We're going to power it off 2 months from now.
Right.
Why 2 months from now? Well, because we might have to put it back. Why? Because we're not sure.
Mhm.
And that's where, again, where that automation and that systems and process engineering is so critical, because
Mhm.
you should be absolutely sure. It's like,
Right.
it's done, right? It's over, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, that device is gone. And that's what you see, right, with cloud, and that idea of ephemeral, right, compute. That model is like, this is an entity that has a life cycle, and when its life cycle is done, we forget about it. It doesn't
Mhm.
come back, right? Some new entity replaces it. That networking doesn't work that way, but
Right.
networking can work that way. That's just now shifting. And that's part of the thing, is when you're doing automation and you're going down a digital transformational journey, it's shifting that thought process, right? Yes, the way you did it for 20 years worked, but it
Mhm.
really wasn't scalable or efficient.
Right.
So
Right.
now we want it to be scalable and efficient. And I love the term. Well, we want to do away with toil so people can work on. I think Elon Musk made this comment like last week. He's like, well, we're going to have those government workers stop working on that, and now they're going to work on bigger problems. What would be the bigger problem? Like,
Yeah.
they process, they do something. What's the bigger problem you'd like them to work on? Like, so that's
Right.
part of the issue. You got to figure that out, right? If your bigger problem is I'm an understaffed networking team,
Right.
then automation is your friend.
Mhm.
But that doesn't necessarily mean, well, because we started to automate everything, well, now we can get rid of people, because that isn't what
Mhm.
happened, right?
Mhm.
So I've even heard this argument from people. Well, if I automate, well, then what do they need me for? And I'm like, okay, well, whatever you automated, guess what? In 3 to 5 years, when you have to replace that system, you're going to have to re-automate all over again, right?
Right. Right.
So that's there's lots of excuses of why I don't want to do it, right?
Mhm.
But because that upfront, right, that the things you have to basically commit to in terms of the sources of truth and getting your process house in order and trying to come up with proper identity and validation and security mechanisms, and a lot of those you have to build, right? Those things are that's the big cost up front, right?
Mhm.
um the great part is that the low hanging fruit, like, how do I automate the configuration of a router interface? Well, somebody wrote a playbook for that. Like, that was the
Right.
first thing that somebody did, you know 10 years ago, right?
Mhm.
But doing that in a repeatable, scalable way, where the state's changed, now it's updated, the source of truth has been updated, I can reverse that, and at some point you can say to, a secretary, hey, just go onto this portal
Right.
and type in the port number and, give us the user's name and we'll be able to configure the network identity for them. Or, hi, just like with your wireless network, hi, just give us your email address and we'll create a set of temporary credentials for you to be able to connect to the network, right?
Right.
Those are solutions that have been solved. Those are problems that have been solved, but they're part of a larger system, and there's interdependencies there that you have to basically, work out so that you
Hmm.
can do it at scale.
Right. Yeah. No, those are all great points. I especially want to sort of put a pin in the idea that, like, if you're avoiding automation because you think it makes you redundant, I think the truth of the matter is, certainly from my perspective and what I've heard enterprises talk about, is that there are so many fires to put out on the network on a daily basis that that automating yourself out of that gets you to a point where you can actually really start to do more interesting work, like thinking about what is actually the most efficient network, and by efficient I mean in all number of ways, right? Like in terms of bigger picture things, like what kind of products am I using, what's my network geography look like, all these more interesting topics only even become available to you when you're not just sort of repeating the same things to keep the lights on, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because that's you. No matter what company you are, if you have it at work, it costs you money, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
you
Exactly.
know,
Yeah.
so inevitably, right? If you think of it from an idyllic perspective, right? What we wanted to do, what we all wanted with SD-WAN was we wanted this AI to look at everything that was going on with the network and then make all of these interesting traffic decisions for us. Oh,
Mhm.
well, I want you to shift that traffic load onto the cheapest link, right, with the biggest bandwidth, right? And I want
Mhm.
this and this. And of course, that's not, we're so far from that, it's not even
Right.
funny.
Right.
But at the same time, right, you know, when you're looking at first this sort of like initially a lot of times with especially when you're doing device automation, you sort of take a templated approach, right? Like I'll build a master template of the device and then we'll build a set of data variable fields that either get manually entered or they come from different sources of truth, and then I can generate a config, right? Then you can build this sort of, we'll call a bill of materials or a bomb, right? And you can literally build your entire environment, you know, on a piece of paper, right? Because
Mhm.
now this is just about aligning data, right? But ideally, right, what you also want automation to do is you also want to be able to move to the point where automation is sort of event driven, right?
Mm.
Sort of like
Mhm.
the idea
Mhm.
of the elastic load balancer, right? Well,
Right.
I'm running at this workload. I've met these criteria. Now I need you to spin up former nodes, right?
Right.
Oh, I have that workload's dropped off. I need you to spin them down. Yeah, we know that problem. They're still working on that problem, but that's a billing thing. Uh, so, but that is ideally what you want. That's why there's been so much investment from vendors on streaming telemetry technologies
Mm.
and sort
Mhm.
of shifting away from that sold SNMP, you know pull, collect. It's like now, you know again, I should be able to look at these streams of data, be able to break them off, right, and then be able to subscribe to them and then build thresholds and limits for them. and
Mhm.
and again, these are the kind of things that some companies do this now. This is, that's not a problem. But there's no cookbook out there that just tells you how to do all this, right?
Right.
So, you know um, there are tools there's tons of material out there on how to do the tools, but there isn't a recipe book. And the reason there isn't a recipe book, right, is because every environment is different.
Mm.
Every business has its own set of criterias, a set of
Mhm.
outcomes it's trying to achieve, right? And what we're sort of seeing now with networking professionals is that part of their shift is not just about, right, you know finding the lowest cost, transport, or or dealing with procurement or whatever, but it's starting to think strategically about this investment, right? And the value that that investment brings, right? Because inevitably, if you ask anybody, you know, about their business, they'll tell you that it's the applications, right, that
Mm-hmm.
make that all work. But
Right.
guess what? If you don't have a network, you can't get to those applications.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
so it no matter how you want to look at it, you know, you still need a network. And there's this belief that, especially, and I think this almost was like a double down after COVID. Well,
Mm-hmm.
everyone was able to work from home, and everything worked fine. And I'm like, well, hold on a second. There's just as many people who said it was absolutely the worst thing that ever happened to them, and that their
Right.
teams just were
Yeah.
almost crushed
Right.
trying to scale up. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and then other enterprises are like, "Whoa, we didn't really notice that." You know,
Mm-hmm.
we had contingencies for this, and etc. But you know, the reality is that, you know, you not everybody had a great, you know, scale up experience, but there's a perception, right, you know, that, well, all these tools will just work with, as long as I have just basic connectivity. And you
Mm-hmm.
know, that's not necessarily true, because you know, we also, when you just look at the size and scale of breaches and transactions, it's like I literally at this point now can correlate from when I start to get spam emails and spam texts from a particular security event that was publicly disclosed. It's like,
Yeah.
oh,
It's true.
that breach
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah.
Oh, it's been 5 days.
It's
Okay,
yeah.
now I'm going to get, you know. So the fact is that just that's part of the challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is
Mm-hmm.
it you, when it works, it's perfect. You know, there's that old saying: no one ever called up to tell you the network was awesome today. They
Yes,
only call up
exactly.
when the network doesn't work,
Yep.
right? So you know, that's, you know, and so if you're, so now when you're starting to like look at your your network not as this large manual, right, costly infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
you know, uh, you know, behemoth, and then you start thinking about, well, how do we sort of manage this, you know, more sensibly and more strategically, and where we can, you know, focus on the larger problems and get rid of a lot of the churn pieces. That's where
Right.
automation really has that big value. And by
Mm-hmm.
the way, it's the same thing with everything else. It's like, it's just like with self-serve, you know, compute, right? Oh, I
Mm-hmm.
click
Mm-hmm.
here and then this machine gets spun up, right?
Right.
Oh, I need to get that loaded up. Well, I'll write a script and it'll write the code. And in those one-off sort of bespoke instances, right? You know, you don't necessarily have to make the kind of upfront investment in building an automated system, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
just
Mm-hmm.
a script. But when you're trying to basically do stuff at scale over thousands of devices and hundreds or
Mm-hmm.
thousands of locations, and you know, now it's a very different monster, right? And you know, I think that people forget especially if you look at the telecommunications industry, the amount of investment that industry has to put in
Mm-hmm.
in automation and telemetry, and you know, and it's massive, right? And no one
Right.
ever thinks about that. They just
Yeah.
think about, oh, my cell phone works and I got my circuit on time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you know, and when you were looking at all the work that the Metro Ethernet Foundation was doing to build all of these APIs to support, you know, B2C, and
Right.
you know, and B2B, and all of those kind of to sort of introduce a way to sort of have a path to automation, right?
Right.
You know, it's not that we all realize that automation is a critical part of, but you know, automating your network, right, is still one of those kind of things where, God, that's an enormous amount of work, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily know if I, you know, if I can get my business to sort of to look at it from a cost perspective, but you know, it just I always use the example of, forget about just your core network, just focus on like security policies, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
think about, you know, if you're an enterprise that has that you has a two product platform, right? You're constantly trying to reconcile, right? You know, firewall rules A sets on product A, and then firewall rules B sets on product B. So, and so now how do I normalize that, right? How do I build an abstraction so that when I create this rule, it'll generate a rule? And again,
Mm,
there's products
mhm.
out there that do that, but you still have to do the basic foundational homework, which is you have to figure out a way to describe that, right?
Right.
And then you have to figure out a way how to basically make that data available, right? And that's a problem that doesn't necessarily get solved by buying a product.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's really that is really interesting. I think one of the overarching themes here is just understanding the scale of the problem, and it's there's not a single answer of like, oh well, you need to look at this level of granularity, but it's being able to look at the total orchestration of the network, right, and understand that vision, but then know that you need to start with some very specific, and sort of bite-sized kind of entry points, right? Rather than trying to, as the cliche kind of term, but boil the ocean. But I think it really applies here.
Of course, and that's why there are things called roadmaps, right? You
Hmm.
know, I mean, network engineers, what do they know about roadmaps, right? You're like, well, but now, even if you're just a network engineer, you know what a roadmap is, right?
Right.
You know, roadmaps are really important because at least roadmaps are telling people what's coming down, right? It used to be, oh, XYZ is going to is going to, tell us what their next release is going to be like. And they're going to tell us all this, right? And everyone's excited, right? But that would
Hmm.
happen like once a year, like, or once every
Right.
2 years.
Right.
Like, so what are they going to do? Are they going to fix my feature?
Right.
Right. But now, right, you know, now it's commonplace. I have a roadmap. My roadmap is, and it's much more clear and more defined as I get closer to delivery dates. It might be a little more abstracted, farther down the road, but there's a path there. So again, that automation journey usually starts off with a clearly defined problem with an outcome. and
Hmm.
and as much as I know this is a shocking thing, especially with the world of cloud, you should define what the kind of investment you're going to make is and how you're going to recoup that investment. Because if that
Hmm.
investment doesn't come back with,
Right.
well, this will save us X number of man hours, and those man hours equal to these dollars,
Hmm.
right? Then how do you justify making that investment at all, right?
Right.
And that's thing. But if you take that approach where you're looking for clear defined outcomes, right, with clear return on investment, and then use that as a method for moving forward, right, then you can bring your leadership on board,
Hmm.
and you can start to basically you know start that journey. But if you are just simply, looking at it from the fact is, I configure 25 routers, I wrote the script on my laptop and I do it, and that's it.
Hmm.
That's great. But you know what? When you leave the company and go someplace else, are you giving that script away to anybody? Or are you
Right.
taking it with you? Right. And by the way, if there's three other guys on your team, are you all using the same script? And where do you keep all the data? In an Excel
Hmm.
spreadsheet? You know,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's that kind of thing where, you know, at some point you have to make a forward investment in how you operate this very costly but very critical asset that you have
Hmm.
supporting a business.
Yeah, yeah, really, very much. You put it this way once when we were talking about it, but thinking of it from a sort of product management viewpoint rather than a purely sort of like coding or engineering standpoint. So,
Yeah, because the thing is, the coding piece is getting easier and easier,
hmm.
right? So so but now, like, translating it into you know like this author Jeff Patton does this wonderful job explaining user stories, right? He goes all over the world and teaches people how to do it. But user stories are critically important, right? I
Right.
need to understand what the user's experience is of that, right?
Right.
So how much time are you going to spend on this, right? And the thing is that that's just as applicable for in your team as it is if you were writing a piece of software for the general consumption by the public, right?
Right. Because they have to use it just like the public does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, yes, there might only be 10 customers,
Mm-hmm.
but but that kind of product thinking can massively impact those 10 customers' lives, right?
Right.
Because that it translates from the difference of spending an entire night up, right, and or missing your kids' play to I have a regular normal working life
Right.
and and yeah, oh, I'm going to take off this afternoon and go watch my kids and the Three
Right.
Little Pigs, right?
Right.
That's huge, and that's the thing is, you want to be able to. Everybody wants to be able to work in those kinds of environments, and that's that's why that journey is worth doing. And even if it's just from the perspective of you bought a product or a platform that already has automation built into it, you still have to take the approach of still applying a product and a systems and a process model for how you're approaching it. Because no matter what that platform is, it's not going to have everything in it, right? You're still going to have to get data from other sources. There's always going to be secondary systems that are going to have to be added. Like, I mean, DNS records are one of those kind of things that no one ever thinks about, right?
Right.
But, and in a lot of cases, they don't even think about them because they don't even have them, right? But it's all those things are important because, unfortunately, humans are not computers. So, and we interface with computers like they're humans. We give them human names. We use human constructs. Those metaphors are always there, right? So, and of course now with AI, we talk to them apparently like they're humans too, which that's a whole other blog right there. But
yeah. Excellent. Well, Michael, we've covered a lot. I think we're out of time here, but before I wrap everything up, and you've kind of probably been talking about this the whole time, but just anything that's particularly interesting to you, I think, in the networking space to look out for, maybe for the rest of this year.
So, what I think is going to be interesting is to see really where AI impacts things, around the idea of networking, network performance, security. I think that's this kind of thing where, like, I was at an event recently, and I was talking to to a WAF engineer, and he's like, "Oh my god, the onboarding of these applications is so tedious," and and I'm like, so I said, so then I asked this vendor, I said, so what are you guys doing with AI? And they were saying, well, yes, we're going to be using AI and I said, why don't you use AI to expedite the process of application data discovery for WAF engines? And they were like, we really thought of that part. And I was like, really? I was like, I would think that would be that's the no-brainer answer, right? So I think that's what I'm waiting to see, at least in terms of networking, is how does AI, right, or basically how do these kind of natural language, models, right? How do we use that to basically expedite the, very traditional manual processes, right? That that everybody needs to go through, and that so that they're more efficient, right? Because if you can, again, it's more of a question if I can just build a natural language model for it. Well, maybe I'm not 100% there. Well, I could get 50% there. If 50% is better than no percent. So for me, that's what I'm starting to look at now, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people ask themselves, well, how does AI impact my life, right? And there's a lot of ways that you can answer that question. But in terms of networking, right, for me, some of the initial use cases I've largely seen is again, that sort of chatbot, interactive sort of informational collection interface, right? That's been how I've seen it. But what I'm expecting now to start to see is companies who are really now starting to go in and create those kind of next gen products that are
Right.
actually saying, yes, well, we've taken all of your, status or inference data from Duo, and we've compared that to this data agent, and we've looked at what your data patterns are, and we've really you are compromised. There's no
Right.
question. We know, and you need to fix that, right? So
Right.
that's where I start. That's what I'm starting to. I expect to see,
Mm-hmm.
because I was reading today. Somebody was like, "Well, finally, VPCs support BGP," and I was like, wow, it's only been a decade or more.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
wow,
Yeah.
so that's the thing is like when you're thinking about networking, that's the sort of spectrum we're on. Like,
Right.
yes, this platform doesn't do this, right? But, you know, we, do, but this platform that does this, but doesn't do that, right? So it's interesting to sort of see, and I largely qualify all these things as largely about what's the problem that the
Right.
most businesses or the most what's the problem
Mm-hmm.
that confronts everybody. But I think that now, right, because networking's largely sort of perceived as a very generic function, right,
Mm-hmm.
you don't necessarily see those kind of like jaw-dropping innovations. It's just like, well, we're going to be at 1.2 terabits, and it's like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
next week, and but yeah, so that's where I sort of see, and that's what I'm sort of hoping for is I really love to see um you know more AI work really working on intent-based networking and more
Mm-hmm.
application aware, right, transactional processing, and basically sort of promoting better quality of service, right,
Right.
for network connectivity.
But
So
the
that's
key there being like really clearly identifiable use cases that are fairly ubiquitous across the market, right? So
right. I think
yeah.
it's I think I said this to somebody the other day. We're sort of have gone as far as we can with a lot of our core technologies, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can keep making things faster, right? And we can replicate, and keep adding processing, but we've sort of hit the physical limitations of some of our technologies, right?
Right.
In terms
Right.
of heat and cost and everything else.
Right.
I think one other thing, one of the big changes I'm expecting to see in the next 5 years is that data centers don't have humans in them anymore,
Yeah.
right?
Well, we could do a whole show about that too.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
fact is that having the humans there is a problem. But now
Mm-hmm.
that's an amazing automation problem right there. How do you build that? Like,
Right.
how do you deal with the automation necessary, right, to manage an environment where you're having to move infrastructure in and out,
Yep.
right? And so it's going to be amazing, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's going to be happening in the next
Yeah.
5 to 10
Yeah.
years. So,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah, excellent. Well, yeah, that was great, Michael. If listeners want to keep up with you, is there a way to do that?
so yes, I do have email. You
Mm-hmm.
can send me an email at mj0u812 at outland.net.
All right. We
Um,
can put that in the show notes
yeah,
too, just make it
and
easier. Yeah.
I'm actually I've only recently been able to do these sort of blogs, so
Right.
I'm thinking of basically maybe doing some more myself or something like that. I used to write articles for Tech Target, and I might start to do that again. I'm not
There
really
you
sure
go.
yet.
I mean, now
You know,
being a sort of free agent in that sense has its benefits, right? So you
yes, it
can
is. I
get
mean,
your thoughts out there. Yeah.
it'll be interesting. It's sort of freeing, at the
Yeah.
same time. The wonderful thing about working at McKinsey is you get to help clients
Right.
solve very complex problems, and they have massive impact. The other side of McKinsey is you can't actually tell anybody that you had anything to do with it. So
Yeah.
so there's
Yeah.
there's an
Yeah.
advantage to being outside, but in the
Yeah.
end, it's really no matter what, it's always really about solving problems, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Absolutely. Excellent. All right.
great.
Well, thank you so much. That was great fun. It'll take me a long time to digest all that, but that's all right. All
Well,
right.
I hope to come back. We'll talk about
Yeah,
something else.
absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Take care.
All right. Cheers. Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.